So thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you about the thoughts in my new book, The Corona Crash. And perhaps we could also talk a little bit about my previous book, Stolen, which Solveig mentioned there. I think there's, and I mentioned the Icelandic experience in the book because I think there's a group of countries, the US, the UK, Iceland, Ireland, Spain, Lithuania, where the experience of financialization has been particularly acute and was particularly acute in the run-up to the financial crisis. And that has certainly had an impact on the trajectory of those economies in the period since 2008, and indeed on, the way in which those states have been able to deal with the economic crisis that has resulted from the pandemic. So that is definitely still a very important part of this. My new book focuses on a slightly different, quite a broader subject, really. It looks at the way in which we've been told that neoliberalism is this ideology that is associated with a shrinking of the state. So if you look back through to the 1980s, when you had the emergence of Thatcherism in the UK, Reagan in the US, and the kind of neoliberal turn that took place in all of our economic institutions, the idea was that governments would be tasked with shrinking the state in order to reduce the amount of government intervention in the market. So the whole premise, and indeed this is a very important part of capitalist ideology, is that society can be divided into a state and a political sphere on the one hand, and a market and an economic sphere on the other hand. And neoliberal ideology was about saying these two things should be separated. But I think what's been very interesting to see, particularly over the course of the last few years, has been actually the way in which neoliberalism isn't associated necessarily with a shrinking of the state. It's actually associated with the reorientation of the state towards supporting the interest of a particular class. Now, to the majority of people, that is experienced as a shrinking of the state because it's a reduction in public services. It's cuts to social welfare. It's privatization, and all of those things hit working people very hard and have continued to hit them very hard over the last 10 years. And that is part of why our economies have performed so badly in the period since the financial crisis, because there have been these kind of long-term problems of low wages, low productivity, low investment, high inequality. And these have been problems that have plagued the global economy as well as certain individual economies. And one of the big problems that we had whilst coming into the crisis was this big buildup of debt. So particularly household and corporate debt. And that was all very much linked with this ideology of kind of pulling the state out of the economy and letting the market regulate itself. This is what left us with this big debt overhang that has made it much difficult to cope with the crisis. But actually what's interesting is if you look back over the last 40 years, over the neoliberal period, whilst for most people, for working people, the state has been pulled back, for the 1%, state support has expanded. Now, the obvious example of this is the financial crisis. And I don't just mean the bailouts that took place in 2008. I mean all the regulatory changes that took place in the preceding years. We could never have had the build-up in the financial sector that we had were it not for the role of the central bank, for example. So setting up independent central banks that would operate as lenders of last resort, that would provide deposit insurance, that would basically say, we are the backstop to the entire country's financial sector. There would never have been the capacity to take all those risks that were taken in the finance sector had there not been that assumption that there was going to be this lender of last resort, that the state was going to step in and save these banks if anything did happen. All the other regulatory changes that took place during that period as well, they all served to support the finance sector at the expense of working people. I mean, in the US, there's a very good example of this in the way in which it was actually government-owned organizations that began the process of slicing up mortgages and turning them into financial securities that were then sold on financial markets. So from the very beginning, whether you're looking at regulation, whether you're looking at lending, whether you're looking at mortgages, whatever, the state is very present in all the processes that give rise to the financial crisis. In the UK, it's even more significant because of the mass sell-off of social housing that takes place, which allows this bubble in the private sector in real estate to inflate much more quickly. So there's everything that takes place around the financial crisis. And then obviously in 2008, governments all around the world are the ones that step up to bail out the banks, even as they're telling working people there isn't enough left for us to provide basic healthcare, basic public services, and basic social security for you. In the period since the financial crisis, we've seen this ideology return in a much bigger way, because the big change in kind of macroeconomic policy that we've seen since the financial crisis has been the introduction of quantitative easing by lots of central banks all over the world. And what this has done is effectively taken public money, channeled it into financial markets, and that money has then been used to kind of purchase private assets. So through the process of quantitative easing, which sees central banks create new money, buy assets from private investors, those private investors have then taken that money and used it to purchase equities, used it to purchase corporate bonds, used it to purchase housing. And it's been this process that is what has seen the big gap emerge between the stock market and the real economy. And this has been particularly clear in countries like the US and the UK, but it's also happened in lots of different parts of the world. Share prices, house prices, they've skyrocketed whilst income has remained flat. And this has been a real source of increasing inequality. And it's been driven by state policy. And I think the interesting thing about the pandemic, and this is what I write about in the book, is the way in which the state has stepped in to save capitalism again. And it is highly likely that the costs of that are again going to be imposed on working people. And I think, the way in which state intervention has been undertaken in different parts of the world shows us the hierarchy of kind of support that is given to different parts of society by the state. So first, there was support for the finance sector. Central banks again created tons and tons and tons of money, pumped it into the finance sector. Then there was support for big businesses. So lots of lending for some of the biggest corporations in the world, some of the most polluting corporations in the world, some of the corporations who treat their workers the worst. After that, we had some support for, this is in the UK, we had some support for mortgage holders. After mortgage holders, we had some support for small businesses. Then at the very end, under a huge amount of pressure from the trade unions, we had some support for workers. And yet there's this whole section of society that's been completely left out. There's support for mortgage holders, but no support for private renters. There's support for big businesses, but no support for people who are on welfare and social security. There's been support for older people, but very, very little support for younger people, again, who are disproportionately in the private rented sector, and support for workers in formal employment, but very little support for precarious workers, for workers in the gig economy, for workers in insecure forms of employment. So there's been this clear attempt to stratify society, where the state is there to support the interests of those at the very top by saying, we have to bail out the banks, we have to bail out big businesses, otherwise the whole economy will collapse and it will be you who suffer. And yet it's those at the very bottom who are watching as all of the money that they're paying in their taxes is siphoned up to the very top of society, leaving those at the very bottom with very, very little. And indeed, all around the world today, as this crisis goes on, we are seeing the implications of those gaps in support becoming very clear. In many countries, there's a huge evictions crisis looming. So in the UK and in the US, there is, when this year comes to an end, probably going to be a lot of people who have been unable to pay their rent because they've been made unemployed and the state hasn't been there to support them, who will be kicked out of their house. that problem of homelessness, which is already so huge in the UK, will continue to mount. And I think another problem that we could be facing in the wake of this crisis is the government saying, we've spent all this money, now we're going to stop. And it's not going to be that they're going to stop spending money on the top 1%. They're not going to raise taxes on corporations. They're not going to raise taxes on wealth. What they're instead going to say is, we've spent all this money keeping the economy going, i.e. we've put all this money into the pockets of private businesses, and now it's going to be working people who are going to be forced to pay for the costs of this crisis. And I think there are a couple of different trends that are going to take place alongside this, which will make the process even more severe. Now, the reason I think that this crisis could make this process of kind of the concentration of power and wealth at the very, very top even more problematic is that alongside this use of state power to support big business, we're also seeing the power of big business increase dramatically. Now, you can see this in the US with the rise of the huge tech monopolies. The big 5 tech companies are now worth about a quarter of the entire S&P 500 index. So that's like 25% of the value of the 500 biggest companies in America. That is a staggering level of market concentration. Jeff Bezos, his wealth has increased so much over the course of the pandemic that he could afford to give every worker at Amazon, that's several 100,000 people, a bonus of $100,000 and still have the same amount of wealth as he did at the beginning of the pandemic. That's how much wealth and power has been concentrated in the hands of this small elite. You can see this as well with some of the other big pharmaceutical companies, with those companies that have done well out of this crisis. And what's going to be interesting as we move forward is that it's going to be smaller businesses who are likely to suffer. Many small businesses, when state support ends, will go under, and it will be the big businesses that will buy up those small businesses' assets, and you'll see more monopoly power in all sections of the economy, not just in the tech sector and the healthcare sector. And these two trends are really, and this is what I write about in the book when I talk about state monopoly capitalism. These two trends are kind of coming together in the sense that we are seeing an economy that is dominated by large monopolistic private firms and increasingly by large monopolistic private banks. And the state, rather than stepping in to kind of break that up, rather than stepping in to reduce the power of those big companies, is actually trying to exacerbate it. Is actually supporting these companies, is giving them money, is giving them access to cheap lending, and at the same time is really kind of ignoring the needs of the vast majority of people in society. So this is why I really think that we need to have a much clearer view of what neoliberalism looks like. It's not enough to say it's a shrinking of the state and we need to be arguing about the state spending more. Because of course, you know, if the left comes forward and says, well, the only problem is that the state isn't spending enough money, the state needs to spend more money, people don't find that argument very convincing. And it's also not the whole truth. Whereas if you flip that on its head and actually say the state is spending too much money on the 1% and not enough money on everyone else, that argument is suddenly much more compelling. People understand it more, and it's much truer as well. And I think this question of really what can only be described as corruption is something that is becoming really, really critical to people's understanding of the economy during this pandemic. In the UK, there are many, many examples of the state using its power and wealth of public resources being channeled into the pockets of some of the richest people in the country. I'm thinking in particular of the role of procurement and big outsourcing companies like Serco, G4S, these companies that undertake spending on behalf of the state. The government in the UK provided Serco, which is one of these big companies, with a contract to undertake our testing and tracing system. Serco completely failed to get anywhere near the required amount of testing and tracing that we needed to tackle the pandemic And yet the contract was renewed, more money was siphoned off to the executives at the top of that company. And it was later revealed that many of these people who had very close links with the Conservative Party had made millions out of this pandemic. It's a similar question with some of the big airlines, for example. EasyJet has received millions of pounds in loans from the Bank of England. And after receiving a big loan, it went on to pay out £170 million to shareholders. And now it looks as though a lot of workers are going to be laid off as well. So the government is channeling all this money to private businesses, saying, if we, give them this money, they're going to keep workers and they're going to invest more. When actually that isn't the case. These companies aren't thinking about workers, they're thinking about their shareholders. So I think there's a couple of implications for this, really, in terms of what we need to be arguing for, rather than just saying, the state needs to spend more money. I think we need to be focusing very clearly on who state power is being used to support. And when the state is being called in to support big business, making sure there are conditions attached. This is something that I think is really important, and it comes on to some of the issues that Varda talks about and researches around the labour market. Because if big companies like EasyJet, for example, are getting huge loans from the state, which makes sense if we want to protect jobs, we should be saying you have to protect jobs. You have to reduce your carbon footprint. You have to improve your corporate governance. You have to recognise unions. You have to allow workers on boards. You have to really transform the way as an organisation you work if you want the public to carry on bailing you out. Now, this, I think, is especially true for the finance sector, which has been, the finance sector cannot exist without the state. The state allows banks to create money in loans on its behalf. If that ability to kind of issue currency was withdrawn from those banks, they would be completely defunct. So banks operate on a license from the state, and yet they're basically performing almost no useful social functions today, especially in the UK. Most banks are not lending to small businesses. They're not lending to first-time buyers. They are lending to people who already own houses to buy new houses. They're lending to huge international corporations. And really, it's often kind of trading and doing things in their investment banking divisions that are not good for society at all. The idea of renewing that social license upon which these banks work and saying, if you want to continue to have support from the state, from the central bank, you are going to have to direct some of your lending to small businesses, direct some of your lending to decarbonisation. Make sure that it's going to different parts of the country rather than just being focused in London. All of these things are just very easy conditions that could be imposed on corporations that needed to seek support from the state. And the fact that again and again and again, the government is just throwing money at big business, throwing money at the finance sector, and then asking working people to clean up the mess that results is just completely unacceptable. And I think this is really the argument that the left all over the world needs to be making in the wake of this crisis. It is not simply that, we don't want to get stuck in an argument about austerity, with the right saying the state should be smaller and the left saying the state should be bigger. I think we need to be having an argument about who the state is for, who these institutions are working for. Because at the moment, they are channeling public resources to those at the very, very top of society, whilst implementing, restrictive legislation that harms people at the very bottom. It's just staggering that you're seeing corporate tax cuts for those at the top at the same time as you've got, pay cuts for people who are fighting this virus on the front lines. It's staggering that you're seeing, legislation being introduced to deregulate various areas of the economy at the same time as unions are being faced with incredibly restrictive legislation to prevent them from organising. It seems like most of the time it's one rule for the people at the top and another rule for everyone else. I think that question of double standards and of really kind of, the corruption that we've seen in our economies in recent years is how we need to frame the debate moving forward. And I think really making sure that people are organising on this basis to demand a Green New Deal when we come out of this crisis, to say that we will not allow the costs of this crisis to be imposed on the poorest, just as the last ones were, saying that actually, we are going to band together as a society to demand that this moment is used to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, to make sure that the financial crisis doesn't happen again, to make sure that we don't have another lost decade of low wages, of rising debt, to actually make sure that we use this moment to decarbonize, to organize, and to reduce inequality and deliver a much more sustainable economy moving forward. And while there is a lot standing in the way, I also think that if you look at the public's attitude towards the kind of capitalism that we have now, most people are increasingly on the side of radical change. If you ask people, do you want things to go back to the way they were before the crisis? The vast majority of people say no. So I think there's a chance here to really start to transform some of our institutions in order to make them much more sustainable and much fairer in the years to come. I will stop there. Thank you very much.